introduce yourself.
Okay, so my name's Zoe. Born and raised in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. And currently work as an art teacher and practicing artist, part-time as an art teacher, mind you, and have always grown up loving creating things and making things. I remember being given a book probably when I was about 11 years old of the works of Andy Warhol, and growing up with parents who were huge Velvet Underground fans. I look at that book now and that's sort of like my marker of my entry into the art world. Absolutely. It's so nostalgic looking at that work and listening to the music. And as kids, we were always around creative people. My parents are pretty creative, and we were taken to lots of different galleries, wherever we were, and theatre shows. And so art and creativity has always been something that I really resonate with and really enjoy being part of.
Did you draw a lot of bananas?
Lots of bananas, absolutely. Actually, I think I brought an artwork in today that features a banana. And I would like to get a banana tattoo, but it's a bit phallic-like and might be mistaken. So I need to think about another Andy Warhol-inspired tattoo, I think. Maybe a Marilyn.
Can of soup.
Yeah, a can of soup, exactly.
So you said your parents are creative. Were they artists?
Yeah, my mum's a potter, although she doesn't call herself a potter. She just thinks she's an amateur potter or ceramicist, but has been doing pottery since about the 70s. And Dad did a lot of work originally in theatre for La Mama. They never followed a career in creative arts, but or careers in creative arts. They just were always part of it, So yeah, we grew up with art and creativity as more than just a hobby. Like, there was a real appreciation for it in our house, which was really nice. My dad's also a writer, so there was a lot of opportunity to dabble in creative practice. But it probably wasn't until I was, sort of after my arts degree that I realised that you could make a career in it. I think my parents always just encouraged us to do it as a hobby, not as a career. And because it doesn't really pay the bills. And so after I finished my arts degree, I did the Dip Ed, which was the 1-year teaching qualification that we could do. And I remember just thinking I'd sold my soul. But actually, I've had a really enriching career as a teacher, an art teacher, and found many ways to weave my practice in, my creative and artistic practice, into my teaching as well. So maybe it wasn't such bad advice from them to go and get that teaching qualification, but at the time I was so angry.
So no regrets, obviously, but is pursuing a career as an artist still on the cards for you? Are you still doing?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I regretted doing teaching at the time, and for the first sort of 6 years, there's always that reminder of failed artists going to teaching because they don't know what else there is to do. And I lost, the saddest part about it was in those first few years of teaching, I lost my creative practice because I just thought it wasn't worthwhile. That said, though, I have had some amazing experiences. I've taught internationally. I've taught in Southeast Asia. I've taught in lots of different settings. I've taught, kids from 4 years old up to 25, adults of 25 years old. I've taught adult drawing classes as well. But it probably wasn't. I completed a master's degree in arts management quite a few years ago thinking that I would give up teaching forever and become an artist or a curator, or really want to write arts policy. It was just after we had this horrendous arts minister in the, I think it was in the Tony Abbott government, that took a lot of arts funding away from the Australia Council and took it out of community arts and put it into high art, the opera, the ballet, the National Galleries and that sort of thing. And I thought, maybe I can really affect some change here, and go out of teaching, use the skills I've learnt and go into arts administration. And it was funny because in my final project, my professor lecturer who was running the project actually said, I actually think you're wasted in the public service, and I don't understand why you have let your creative practice slide. Why can't you find a way to do that and affect change in education? And so I did some research on art and wellness, and then what it means to be an art teacher who has or hasn't got a creative arts practice themselves. And I remember taking this sample into my professor and saying, oh, look what one of my 5-year-old students did today. They'd done this beautiful interpretation of Van Gogh's Sunflowers. And he said, that's your project. How did you get them to do that? And I said, I demonstrated as an artist, as someone who knows aesthetics and understands materials and techniques. And he said, that's your project. And so I think he was probably right. I don't think someone who has a hands-on job like being an art teacher and who is so immersed in the industry, I don't know that I could have probably gone into an administration job or arts administration. I needed to be down in the trenches with helping young artists find their creative practice through showing them mine. And that's generally now how I teach, is showing them how I do it and then getting them to discover their own practice through what I do. And it kind of changed everything for me that moment. I realised, yes, I am an artist and I value my practice, and it is something that I work at every day. I mean, it's like whenever I'm drawing, it's like going to the gym for me, I feel that real connection to what I'm doing. It feels really healthy. And then to be able to share that with young people that I come across in my teaching practice is really lovely at a grassroots kind of in the trenches level. And, there's never going to be enough arts funding. And we're never going to see the arts funding model changes, I don't think. We'll never see... there'll never be a time where artists don't have to apply for grants like hospitals don't have to. I just don't think that's going to happen.
I mean, what changes would you make given the opportunity?
Yeah. I think what I would want to see is the understanding of the social and emotional capital that the arts creates for us as a society. And if you think about public services, health, education, although that's suffering a little bit at the moment too, law and order, all of these public services that we have, they never have to apply for funding yearly. And they're never, imagine if a hospital had to apply for funding to continue to operate year in, year out, and they had to rely on philanthropy, and they had to rely on ticket sales, and they had to rely on that sort of thing. Imagine if we thought about the arts as a place that offers us help, like that social capital, and that if we understood that it was healthy for a society to have a thriving arts industry, I hate that word, but, arts service, imagine what that would be like for our culture and our connection to storytelling and each other, And there's so much evidence to suggest that it is good for us. I did some research on after September 11, Downtown New York was, of course, heavily affected. Lots of theatres, lots of tiny little clubs that were sort of underground, and art galleries and things like that. And they actually used the arts as a way of bringing people back downtown. So they said that there was an organisation that threw a heap of money at these tiny little venues and said, hey, apply for money. Don't need to fill out a grant request. Just tell us how much you need to keep your doors open, to encourage people to come back out. And what it did was it actually worked. It actually brought people back down to that area below 14th Street, and to that little arts hub that we know from downtown in New York, with no questions asked, you know. And it wasn't like artists committed any kind of like, the money was used for what it was intended for, because the value placed and the emphasis placed on arts bringing people together. And we've seen it here with bushfires in Victoria. We see artists who go out into these communities and just bring some equipment, drumming, drawing, crocheting, come to the town hall, come and join us as a way of getting everyone back together and connected, and feeling like they have a place to grieve and that's all done through the arts.
Yeah.
And so I think that was a long answer to your question, but it's this idea that we actually just value it as a service, as opposed to an industry.
Do you think there's another way, I guess, for artists to get support, like maybe without the government, maybe through their own communities, patrons? Is that? I mean, I'm sure that happens on some level, but is it possible to expand that? Because sometimes I think governments, local and state and federal, when they try to do good, they end up doing more harm.
Yeah. And look, I actually think that philanthropy and the model, I'd hate to see philanthropy take over as the number one way that artists can access funding. I do think the taxpayers can really benefit from the arts, and I think the government should continue to fund it. But I do like the idea of moving into a philanthropic model where you do see, wouldn't it be great if BHP could throw some money at art, or and I know there's tax benefits for those really wealthy companies, and I know that there are some funding opportunities, but I'd like to see that a bit more sustainable. And there are foundations in the States where that funding is sustainable year in, year out. It's always available.
And it seems a lot of those things like tax breaks and all that benefit arts organisations that already are doing well.
Correct.
And artists that are already doing well. It doesn't really help any grassroots movements.
Correct.
Like that.
I mean, you only have to Google how much the CEO, or I forgot what their title is, of the NGV earns. And it's it's a pretty decent salary.
How much is it?
I think it's about 220,000. Yeah. So, I think you're right. I think there is, unfortunately, a lack of value that's placed on grassroots and emerging art. I was really lucky enough to do 6 months in Amsterdam, and I worked for a commercial gallery but had no fixed address. So they were a pop-up gallery. They had a few artists on their books, and they do shows. And being a part of that art community, I then learnt about other arts organisations that weren't commercial. And I remember this organisation, OT 301, pretty sure it is. So OT 301 is the address of this particular art space. And back in the 90s, it's this beautiful old Dutch building, and back in the 90s, the council wanted to tear it down to put a bike path through that neighbourhood, and that building would no longer have existed. And it was basically a place, it's a place where, you know, creatives lived. There was a bit of squatting going on, but very community focused and creative space for anyone that could get involved. Anyway, so I went to, it does still exist. The building never got torn down. And I went to this like weird kind of Tuesday night show in Amsterdam where someone was lying on the floor and like someone was doing some spoken word. But, you know, there was probably a crowd of about 30 people there and it was really nice. They had live drawing and all kinds of things on. But I interviewed them for my master's, the people who managed the space. And when the council identified that building for demolition, the people who were living and benefiting from that building started a community a campaign to buy the building. And so it's this first kind of idea of Patreon and so forth. And so they managed to raise the funds. And now the building the community now owns it and it can never be torn down. And so they saved it, essentially. And, you know, stuff like that's happening in Melbourne right now with the Tote. I don't know if you've been following that the building in which the Tote, the fantastic live music venue in Collingwood, is up for sale. And there's a huge community campaign and a huge community drive that's going on right now to secure that building.
For like a collective of people.
That's right. That's right.
That,
yeah, right. And so, you know, I think it's these kind of movements that the art so heavily relies on. But why is it that these buildings are worth more to us torn down than they are still standing, given what they offer the community, like spaces for expression, spaces to play music? And I ended up really enjoying going to that space in Amsterdam, because without it, like that narrative's gone. And we can't afford to lose that narrative and that culture. I don't think, you know, I don't think humans will survive without our art and culture. And maybe that's an issue, because you can't really see that social capital. You can see the social capital, but you can't see what it's doing to you in here. You know, you go for a run, you go to the gym, you get fit, you tone up, you look good. But that sort of result doesn't happen if you see an exhibition that really touches you. It's in here, you can't see it.
Subjective, it's entirely subjective.
Yeah, and kind of a little bit esoteric or a little bit like intrinsic or something. You know, you feel good, but you can't visualize it or you can't see it. Yeah, and going to something weird on a Tuesday night, it was just such a nice collective thing to do with others. So yeah, I think it's Patreon and supporting one another is really important, but I do think there is a responsibility from governments and so forth to ensure that the arts. And an interesting fact, actually, more people go to see art and culture, and especially live events in Melbourne, than they do go to the football.
I believe that.
Right, you know, and I think, yeah, that's and the arts makes more profit in Victoria than infrastructure.
Well, that's a new one to me.
Right, like it's you know, it's bringing in profit, and you think about the tourism, you think about Melbourne as a destination, but it relies on profit to continue its longevity. Like, when did it become a profit-making exercise?
What would you think of the idea of, like, we have heritage listed buildings?
Yeah.
They did something similar with arts and arts precincts. And
Yeah,
things like
wouldn't that be amazing?
Just a thought that I had just
Yeah.
then.
Yeah, to ensure that longevity of artist studios or art spaces are available would be incredible. It'd be so
that
great.
would help a place like the Tote
Absolutely.
you know, from being redeveloped or
Becoming apartment blocks.
exactly.
Yeah. And look, there are some things happening. There's certainly the old Collingwood, or the Collingwood Yards as it's now called. There's still Fitzroy Community Arts Centre, which I think is so important that we maintain a space like that in our community. There's the Abbotsford Convent, which is still considered a community arts centre as well. Gasworks down in Albert Park, where no matter who you are, you can turn up and enjoy being immersed in art and culture. They need some kind of heritage listing. And actually, interesting fact about the Abbotsford Convent, that was marked for demolition as well in the 90s, when Jeff Kennett was the Premier. And a grassroots action occurred where everyone in the Abbotsford and Collingwood community said, no way can we lose this as part of our history. Because, you know, they would have built these riverfront kind of apartments and properties because it's a beautiful spot of Abbotsford. And so the community, a bit like Fitzroy Pool, they campaigned, raised awareness, and the state government said, okay, we hear you, but you're never going to get any more arts funding or never going to get any more government funding from us. If you want to keep this this space that could be making us millions of dollars from development, you have to find a way to fund it yourself. And like, my voice is elevating listening to this because it's so heartbreaking to think that space, that land was worth more torn down, the building was worth more torn down than it is existing as this kind of centre for people to gather and use the grounds. And you know, the grounds expand as far as Collingwood Children's Farm. That would have gone. You've got the beautiful old buildings of the convent. You've got affordable artist studios still there. Like, where would those artists have gone? And so, look, the convent, the administrators have kind of done an amazing job to keep that going. And yes, they have a lot of commercial hire now. I see they do weddings and all kinds of functions, but it's still there. But imagine if it was heritage listed. And imagine if it was just this kind of space for artists to enjoy and gather and things like that.
I guess I can see two sides of the coin with that. I mean, sometimes a bit of pressure draws out your passion, kind of like how restriction is good for art making.
Right.
Like that pressure that makes people think creatively, how are we going to keep this space running? Or this,
That's right.
know? And that's, you know, the Abbotsford Convent is just absolutely, it's a magical place.
Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
glad they figured out a way. But yes, at some point, some protection would be nice.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just to know that will be there for future generations as well. And, you know, that it doesn't get sold to developers who are about making profits, you know. Exactly. And putting a price on art and culture, I don't think should be about profit making.
Some people will disagree with you.
I mean, yeah, I'd like to obviously sell a bit more art and not have to work in a school part-time, but that's unfortunately the reality of the society that we currently work in, and it's just the way it is.
That leads me to your art.
Yeah.
Tell us about your art. What are you making? What do you make?
Yeah, at the moment, my main practice is drawing. And a lot of my practice is influenced by the work I do in my classroom with my students. So recently I've been teaching at a TAFE level doing drawing. So I'm always practicing whatever it is I'm teaching. I've got quite a lot of students at the moment who are really interested in textiles and sewing. So my practice has been around definitely dabbling with some textiles and sewing, but Recently, and my work is always about where I live, the neighbourhood of Fitzroy, and what I observe as someone who spent a lot of time in their childhood in Fitzroy and has returned there as an adult now. And I actually call that home. A lot of my work currently is around this decision that I now am saying out loud. As a 38-year-old professional in my mid-career, I've made an active decision not to have children. And so a lot of my work is around what that means and how to identify as a female who doesn't procreate and what my purpose is on this earth if I'm not going to be procreating. And I think I recently got involved in a project down on Hosier Lane where there's a whole group of female identifying people who gathered and occupied space on International Women's Day. And so I kind of made some propaganda art about this choice and so forth. And not a week goes past without someone sort of sending me a message on Instagram saying, you know, I feel so seen, I feel so heard. And so I think from that, I'm heading down a path exploring this idea and this notion at the moment. And I regularly go to life drawing. I'm very disappointed when there's a male model on the floor because I'm really interested in looking at the female form and what that might look like depending on whether you have chosen to have babies or not. It's totally fine if women do choose that, because I do really like children. I'm a teacher, obviously, and I am also an auntie. So yeah, and I think coming back to living in Fitzroy, that is generally an area for people who maybe don't want to be responsible for living out in the burbs with two kids and a big TV. I still can live in Fitzroy as I approach 40 and still be responsible, but still live that kind of cosmopolitan existence without children and still have my friends and family over who do have kids. They love coming to my house. So that's where my work is. That was a really long answer to that question. But I think it all started when I moved back from overseas. I was away for a couple of years and I really wanted to live in that neighbourhood, but really thought, oh, maybe it's time for me to grow up. But now I'm there, I'm like, oh, I am grown up and my life is, I have got this creative path that I've chosen and it's a little bit unique and it's a little bit different, but I'm really comfortable with it as well. And I'm terribly afraid of the climate emergency. So I think that's kind of influencing, that influences a lot of my art and so forth as well.
Is that one of the reasons for the not wanting to have children?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there kind of an internal battle there?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So does that find its way into your art?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, I feel really stifled by the suburbs. And look, I still love my friends who live out in the burbs, but, you know, I feel like there's, now that I've come to terms with the fact that I don't want to live this kind of atypical life where you get married, you have some kids, you get a dog, and you move out into the burbs. It's taken a while to accept that and not feel and not have that kind of fear of judgment of being a creative, working part-time, scraping by every, you know, fortnight before you get paid. And also too, like, this was the reason women were kind of put on this earth, was to procreate. And I think now that I'm able to, that has definitely influenced my work. And that internal dialogue, I'm certainly very, it helps being creative because it helps you work through this kind of battle. Like a lot of creatives, I think, have that creative practice to express where they're going.
You're very open about this subject.
Yeah.
do you think it's in arts circles and general as well? Is it received well? Do you think?
Yes and no. I mean, we know that women are underrepresented in art spaces and in big art institutions already. I do think in Melbourne it's a very male-dominated industry. I wonder if, I don't know enough about whether that's because women feel like they can't be artists because they've got to raise a family and that might get in the way and so forth. However, the work I have displayed about this and the work that's very Fitzroy centred, certainly I'm hearing from a lot more young women who are feeling exactly the same. And there's a lot of us in inner city Melbourne too who are, and I'm connected with groups of females who are making that decision too. So I think it's probably postcode driven at this stage. And it's kind of a new thing that I've decided to actively put into my artwork. I think I was always quite interested in the female form, but I didn't know where I was going with that. And now I think it's more about that understanding of, I still function as a woman or as a female, but I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and how do you kind of navigate that? So I think, the feedback so far has been really good. I'm working on some pieces at the moment. And there's a delicate line between being too shouty and also being like a little bit more subtle, because I don't want people to feel like I hate them because they've had kids. Like, I love kids and I love all the children that are in my life and I love teaching them. I love being around young people. So there is also that fine line about being too shouty and being like, the world's fucked and, look what we're setting up these poor children to live with. And also just being like, you know what, I'm choosing this, you can choose that, and everyone's fine. And it's been really interesting. Like, no one really asks you, why do you have kids? Everyone just asks you, why don't you? And so I think it's just changing that a little bit as well without being too abrupt or something. Yeah, I'm conscious of being too shouty at this stage, but, that might change the more that I work in this area. Perhaps. I also make a lot of kids' art. Actually, I've got a new nephew. I've made a fair bit of art for him recently for his nursery. I also make a lot of art with my students as well. There's a lot of collaborating that goes on, which is kind of nice.
So that would diverge from what you usually do, I'm guessing. What happens there? Yeah,
absolutely. Well, let me think about that at the moment. Who have I got doing something interesting? A lot of my students that I teach at the moment, my themes are not clear in their work. There's a definite separation of themes and ideas. But in terms of materials and techniques, if you work in a material or technique for a long amount of time, you become quite skilled in it. And that's the knowledge that I transfer to young people through their ideas for art making. And so that, when you're in the classroom, you're making art every day. You're showing someone how to do something. You're teaching observational drawing. You're teaching them an entry point into their work, but you're also intervening when you know when to intervene, because if you practice and immerse yourself in art, you know when that needs to occur, which is that's interesting too.
How old are the kids?
Right now I'm working in senior high school. So my students range from 16 to, I think I'm teaching someone who's 21 at the moment in a flexible school environment. So it's not a government school. This is a school for I'm working in a school for disengaged youth, which is a lot of them are electing art just because it makes them feel good. And for some of them it's again, it's a way they can express themselves, whether it's through image making or writing as well.
When teaching them, it's one thing to teach the technical aspects, like how to draw a line or a face, I should have.
Yep.
How do you foster the creative thinking? Like, how do you do that? How do you approach it?
Yeah, it's interesting, you know. I try and help them find their own practice. I think a lot of young people have not had a great experience in art education, or again, like me, they don't see a connection to career. And so I think a lot of what my job is teach you how to make a mark on a page, draw a line, render, that sort of thing. But also my job is to teach them how to engage with and discover their own creative practice. And look, I've got young people who draw photorealism. I'm not a photorealist drawer myself, but we can still work together, you know, and I can still guide them through that practice and help them to discover it. But then I taught a student many years ago, very much at the start of my career, and I bumped into them on Brunswick Street the other day. And, you know, they recognised me. Oh, do you remember me? I said, of course I remember you. Your name's Aaron. You had 2 sisters. And I said, I always remember your funny little childlike stick figure drawings. They used to create these kind of really aesthetic, like they used elements really well. They were able to combine shape, mark making, drawing, create these little characters. And I said, I'll never forget those. And I said, are you doing something creative now? He said, oh no, I've actually become a nurse. But I thank you for encouraging me with those little drawings, because on the side I do tattoos. And so he does these little black outline tattoos. And he said, you were the only one that encouraged me to continue with my own style. And so I think that's my job, is to facilitate that discovery of style and practice through the applications of aesthetics and through the applications of a material or technique that would lend themselves well. And look, I'm not a great printmaker. Some of my students are, but I can guide them through that practice and help them to discover their own style as printmakers or drawers or painters. And look, whatever I'm teaching, I always have to brush up myself. I don't think you could teach literature if you weren't interested in reading. I think it's like art. I don't think you can teach art unless you're kind of interested in it and doing it. So I think it's more about that discovery of individual practice. And what is your style? Yeah, do you do abstract shapes? Do you do things really well with colour? Do you avoid colour? And it's just then me helping them join all those dots and bring it together. And you can do that with students of any age. You know, I've done it with 5-year-olds before, and, you know, I've done it with 20-year-olds. You can find a way to appreciate everyone's mark making, I guess.
Okay, that's you said when we were chatting before we're setting this up, you mentioned I remember you mentioned the word mark making and intuition.
Yeah.
Is that does what you said previously cover that?
I think so. I was
trying to understand it, I guess. I was trying to understand what you meant by intuition and mark making. I haven't got the message in front of me.
So I think the hardest thing for any creative is a blank canvas or a blank piece of paper. And especially if you're 5 years old, or even if you're 10 years old, that can be so daunting. And so I think that idea of mark making and getting into your own flow state or create an artistic practice and drawing can really benefit from someone helping you enter. And so I used to do a lot of this, and I didn't probably realise this until I came across the work of, what a surprise, a male researcher from like the 1930s, I think he was from, who did a lot of research into early childhood development through the arts and visual arts. There was another guy called Piaget who looked at childhood development through cognitive behaviour and that sort of thing. But this other guy, Herbert Reed, did a lot of research and observation on kids from the age of 3 years old up to sort of teenage years. And if you've ever seen a child dance, a 5-year-old dance, they dance like there's no end. They just feel the music, they do it, and they just do it without even thinking about what they look like or how they feel. They just feel it in their body. And he says the same thing about art. So, when a child's learning to make marks, so that's how we first start to communicate to anyone around us. We can speak a little bit, but we draw, and a child of 3 years old uses their arm, they use their shoulder, they get their body involved in their work. They have no fear of putting something down on a piece of paper. You see a young kid with a paintbrush, and they're, doing this kind of action, mixing paint, and they're very tactile. They touch things, and they get their whole hands involved. And as they go through, they come to school, we kind of discourage that. We discourage that because, it's really hard to measure that on a graph. You can measure reading levels, you can measure what they do in maths, but somehow along the way we've lost our ability to measure childhood development through image and mark making. So what I used to do is, based on this guy's research, I used to have my programs or my projects set up so depending on where they were at in their development, they were able to enter the task quite confidently. So 5 years to 7-year-olds, shapes, abstraction. We'd often look at, say, the young students love hearing artist stories. So, we'd talk about Van Gogh and what his life was like, and we'd look at the sunflowers, and then I might get them to look at the sunflowers and draw their own interpretation of it. And look, you get all kinds of interpretations because maybe they've seen a sunflower before, or it reminds them of their nana's house, or it reminds them of being in outside in nature, and they bring in their experiences that they have as a 5 to 7-year-old. They do a lot of tactile things. We used to, do a lot of collage and tearing and feeling. We used to do a lot of painting not with a brush, but with alternative materials. So let's go and find something that we can apply paint with and make some marks. Doesn't matter what it is. It can be whatever you like, but let's just go onto that blank canvas. Because then by the time they reach about 9 years old, just before 9 years old, so grade 3, grade 4, they're starting to really understand depth and perception. And so that's when you want to start teaching things like landscape painting or perspective drawing sometimes on a very basic level. And because that's where their brain is thinking, it's much easier to guide them into that task. And so I used to do a lot of 3-dimensional work with years 3 and 4. A bit of sewing, things that you can that have different sides and so forth. And then once they reach sort of grade 6 into early high school, they're completely self-conscious and they don't want to draw any attention to themselves, and they really devalue anything they do in art. And so as an art teacher, I would then go back to things like abstraction, but with a more emphasis on aesthetic qualities. So we used to do a lot of pattern making. We looked at one of the most successful projects I did with grade 6 was looking at Yayoi Kusama's work and looking at the way in which she sees the world through dots and shapes and pattern and that sort of thing. And if you can keep them engaged, the research shows that if you keep young people engaged until they're, around 14, 15 and 16, they'll have some kind of creative practice or understanding of creative arts for the rest of their life. But if they disengage in those abstract years, it's hard to get them back.
But it's possible.
It is possible, so long as once they come to me at senior high school, I say, I love your stick figures. That's your style. Let's build on that style. Let's appreciate the fact that you could be a photorealist, and I believe anybody can learn to draw at any age. It's not a talent that you're born with. It's definitely not a talent you're born with. It's like, if you practice the violin every day, you'll get good at it. If you practice art every day, you'll get good at it. But it's then about it, that's capturing them at that senior high school level and then really helping them discover that practice that may have been lost or they may have disengaged with in middle school. And it's tragic seeing that happen. It really is tragic. And so I think for me, and that learning that intuitive mark making is important to recognise that when you can confidently draw a line on a page, that's your work and that's where you start. You know, I often say to older teenagers, I'm only asking you to make a mark. I'm only asking you to draw a line. I don't care what it looks like. Just draw it. Just get it on the paper, you know? And I think there's something really nice that happens when especially older teenagers see that. It's like, yeah, just draw a triangle. See what happens. And then turn the triangle into something or make it something or turn it upside down or flip it around or tear it up, you know? And there is, when you take that expectation away, or you take that idea of it has to look like something or it has to be something, you see that confidence happen. And that's when they go into that flow state like a child dancing, you know, and there's that intuition and that starts to take over.
Are these regular schools that you're working at, or it sounds like you might work at like a Steiner school?
Yeah, so I currently work at a flexi school, which means students who, or young people who have not sort of fit in to mainstream school would attend. And so I'm only new to this practice in this school. I've only been there for about a year and a half. I have come from mainstream school and I've worked at some really good ones and I've worked at some that felt like factories where everyone's work looks the same. And I've worked at a primary school setting, which was fantastic because I just love watching kids draw without that fear of judgment. And I always used to say to my students, it doesn't matter if your work looks like the person's next to you, it's your work. But I was really lucky. Early in my career, so I've been teaching since 2009. Early in my career, I worked at a high school that was out in the eastern suburbs and was an old technical school. And so there are a lot of teachers there, and a lot of the teachers who mentored me in those early years had come from a technical setting. And so we didn't write curriculum and we didn't document anything, but we just got young people and teenagers making stuff. And it didn't matter like how, what, where, or who, you just did it. You know, you just came to an art class and whatever you wanted to tinker away at. And I think I've rediscovered that practice because I did go through a mainstream time in my career where I did work in mainstream schools. And like a lot of kids, like I just didn't fit into that system of measuring success on graphs. And I don't. And so, yeah.
A lot of artists are the same.
I think so. I think it's really hard working in that real kind of template-oriented model. So I am. I'm more interested in working in these alternative settings and working in community arts. I've done some work at Fitzroy Community Arts, holiday workshops and things like that where you don't even know who's going to turn up. So you do have to find a way to help them in and help them engage with creative arts. Because you get 10 kids in a holiday program who you've never seen or met before. So it's finding how do you get them in. as well, with all their experience that they bring to their art making.
It's a real shame about technical schools too, being kind of, there used to be heaps, but I think they're all gone, aren't they?
I think pretty much so now. Yeah, it's devastating. And some of the things that kids, again, when I bump into kids in the street that I've taught before, I mean, they're all adults now, but the things they remember is that real hands-on learning and how you could be whoever you wanted to be in our class and do whatever you wanted to do. I mean, there is some times where I'm like, I have to break it to a young person that's like, oh, sorry, that's kind of been, you want to make stencils like Banksy? Oh, that's kind of already been done. Can we do something else? Can we try something else? And, obviously you get to a stage where you've seen it all, but you need to gently prompt them into a different area. Perhaps maybe you could explore this option. So that's also a bit of a challenge. But yeah, you're right. The technical schools, and even I remember having my first few years of teaching, having a dark room, and having a room of 20 sewing machines where you'd have kids just sewing stuff and making stuff. Clay, I've taught many years in ceramics rooms. Actually, someone said to me the other day, it must have been really hard teaching ceramics because, I remember when I was in high school, it was kind of a bludge subject. I said the best thing that you could do as a ceramics teacher, and I still believe this today if I ever teach ceramics, on the first day you get everyone to throw the clay. You're allowed to throw it once, one lesson, the first lesson, roll it up, throw it on the roof, throw it at each other, and then that's it. Get it out of your system, And if you do it again, then we need to talk, and I'm going to make your life hell. I'm going to make you scrub all the tools, or you'll only be allowed to construct. I remember one year I made a student construct their teapot out of paper, because they didn't listen to the rules. But you're allowed one day, one lesson where you can throw the clay. Just do it, get it out, and then that's it.
I think you would have been too tough for me.
And same with the sewing machine. You can try and sew your finger. You won't be able to because it's got a guard on it. So try and do it, and then it's over. And of course, you'd get one smart ass that would somehow manage to sew their finger, but everyone else would be like, yeah, it is really hard to get your finger under there, isn't it? And then that person looked like an absolute idiot because everyone would be like, how did you even manage that? There's always someone that tries to. So, yeah, it's, those were, I hate to say it, like, I still love teaching a lot and I still love seeing people engage with their practice, but it's not like it used to be, sadly, There's a lot more admin and more graphs and data than I'd like to see.
One last question.
Yep.
Zoe, you touched on something earlier that I've been thinking about, I guess, for a little while now. It was about how you were saying the women in arts and how at the top there's a lot of men and there's not so many women in the arts in general. And I guess one thing I've noticed is you're right, at the top, and at all levels in the sense like, artists and gallery owners as well. There's males outnumber females, but I've noticed at the entry level, it's the majority's women.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that, and I was wondering why as well.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe it's because I don't think there's a societal reason in terms of pressure to not do art, but I think you might be right in terms of having families and stuff like that, and something has to give, something has to be sacrificed there. Having said that, is it even possible to lift those women up higher when they're choosing not to, and is it worth actually trying to
Yep.
kind of pressure them into,
Yeah.
you know, taking on all the not the responsibility, the challenge of
Yep.
rising up through the ranks. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if you've heard of a word called patriarchy. And it's been an issue for centuries, unfortunately. But there is a lot of research now that suggests that, and look, I don't know how to explain it, but I see it where, especially there's a lot of the research is in the corporate world. And the research suggests that if there's a promotion in a company that a woman works for that is available for her to apply for, she won't go for it unless she can complete or respond to all the selection criteria. So she'll often say, oh, maybe I'm not quite ready. However, in corporate settings, you will always have men apply for jobs when they can only respond to 2 sections. And they'll say things like, I don't know how to do this, but I'm willing to learn.
Yeah.
Or, yes, I've got some experience, or yes, I know what that's all about. Why has that happened? I don't know.
I'd like to see that. I mean, I live by that. Better to do something poorly than not at all.
That's right.
And I'd love to see everyone, not men and women.
That's right.
Women actually probably need to do it more.
Yes.
Going by what you just said. But
yeah, and I wonder if there's less value on people like me, definitely. I mean, I didn't think I was an artist until a male professor told me when I was doing my master's. I never called myself an artist. And I never would think that my work was valuable even to go into a gallery, let alone compete with an industry that's heavily dominated in the mid-career and upper career by male artists. So I do think that there, and perhaps family, and perhaps the idea of it not being taken as a serious job as well. I know of a lot of successful contemporary male artists who have never been to art school and are doing selling lots of work and getting a lot of commercial success. But then there's a lot of women who have been to art school and go, oh, no, it's too hard. I don't want to do the hustle. It's interesting. It's probably, the facts are there. I don't know what the action is. Yeah. The statistics are there, but I don't know how to turn that around. Yeah. And look, perhaps it's a case of I've talked to colleagues and collaborators who've said maybe we just need more networking opportunities for women or women-only galleries. It's kind of interesting, but I don't know what the action is that needs to take place. But I do think that it's certainly common. The last school that I worked at, 1 female out of 7 males was in leadership. That's problematic. But I think that's systemic, and that's, we're still trying to break down that patriarchal kind of society that we do have, not just in corporate, but I think it is relevant in the arts too. And look, I mean, perhaps there's the idea of the male gaze, the female was always the model. She was always the muse. She was always, owned by men. Picasso is one of the examples of that. So how do we change that to the woman becoming the artist practitioner as well? And look, I think there are some incredible women who are doing that. I've just come back from a reconnaissance mission to New Mexico, where I went and visited a lot of Georgia O'Keeffe country. And gosh, what a remarkable woman to move to such a desolate landscape where men laughed at her. And they wouldn't even sell her part of the ghost ranch because they were afraid that she wouldn't survive and she would be hysterical and she'd cause all this chaos. But actually what she created, that legacy there, is now heritage listed and can't be touched. And Yayoi, I love Yayoi's work. Probably the most successful female living artist in Japan right now. So I think they are out there. I don't know how you foster that at a grassroots level. That I'm not sure about. Education, keep girls in education longer. And that's where I try and encourage lots of female students that I teach, you know, just do an arts degree. You know, just do painting because you love it. Who cares what the job is? You'll get a job. Just do what you love. And look, I'm forever grateful for my arts degree, even though I'm still paying it off.
And I think I'll add to that. Try and do something that you're not sure you can do.
Yeah.
I mean, that for me personally, that helps a lot because that really builds up your confidence when you get the results that you hope for. I think so. And if you love painting or you love drawing or sculpting, I just say do it. Or creative writing. It doesn't matter what the job is. You can always do teaching. We'll come full circle. Well, on that note, Zoe, thank you for coming along.
Thank you.
This has been great.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
Cheers.
Thank you.